Yeah, can you hear me while it's working? Is it working, yes or no? Okay, cool, thanks a lot. So, let me get started now. Yeah, time elapsed 1 second. Okay, folks, good evening then, and thanks for attending. I kind of hope, to be honest, that the relevance of the question that we are addressing today is not going to affect you personally anytime soon, it goes without saying. Oh, and you can't even see my slides, that's even better. Now, let me try again. And here we go. And let me start perhaps by talking briefly about the terminology that I'm going to use tonight, and I suspect Alex and I agree on this issue. When we talk about assisted suicide, we're really talking here about the idea that somebody kills him or herself with the assistance of another. And just to give you an example, there could be a situation where, say, you have a woman with advanced ALS. She's getting a prescription from her doctor for barbiturates and uses that drug to kill herself. This is why suicide is part of this term. When you think about voluntary euthanasia, on the other hand, that's a situation where you kill another person whose life is no longer worth living to them in accordance with the wishes of that person, and this is why the voluntary comes in. And a good example of this, for instance, could be, say, a man is bedridden with many of the consequences of a massive stroke, whose physician, at his request, gives him lethal injection of barbiturates and muscle relaxants, for instance, and that kills him eventually. So tonight, when I use the phrase assisted dying, I will refer to assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. Do keep in mind that in fact, there are other forms of assisted dying. For the purpose of the debate tonight, we have agreed to only talk about assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. Let me also make a remark on facts tonight. My best advice to you, to your decision making with regard to wherever you stand on this particular issue would really be to take with a very big grain of salt claims of fact that you will hear tonight, and it doesn't matter whether you hear from me or you hear from Alex. If your decision on where you stand on this issue depends on particular empirical claims, then we urge you to really check the claims that are being made tonight. Look at the empirical literature, look at peer-reviewed journal articles, and check whether claims that are being made are actually reflected in those articles. I suspect sometimes you might be surprised that that isn't always the case. So what is the situation? The situation, of course, as you know, the one thing I want to offer, at least to anyone here, if you want to get links or relevant journal articles with regard to any of the claims that I make, I'm happy to forward them to you. So just go to the Queen's website, pick up my email address, and email me. Assisted dying, of course, as we've heard already in the introduction, is illegal in Canada, but it's legal in various jurisdictions. So in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, we are in a situation that both voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide is legal or decriminalized. Switzerland, Oregon, Washington State, and at the moment, at least in Montana, assisted suicide is decriminalized. As you know, moves in this direction are afoot, as the leaders of government supported both in Quebec and in Tasmania. Believe it or not, despite my accent, I'm actually also Australian. I want to now start looking at the question of why shouldn't we decriminalize? And I want to give you here a patient perspective. The person whose views you will be hearing just now, it's only a 2-minute clip, is Andrew Colgan. Andrew Colgan is dead today. He traveled to Switzerland to end his life by means of assisted suicide, not voluntary euthanasia. So let me play this clip now, fingers crossed.
It would be Andrew, I expect.
Terry, how are you?
Fine, thank you, sir.
Sorry, it's not the thing you kind of expect Terry, perhaps you just want to actually live in it.
How old are you, Andrew?
42.
When did you get it? MS, isn't it?
Yes.
MS.
I started to have tiny symptoms going back to the 90s, but I was actually diagnosed in 2003. Most mornings I get out of bed by falling out of bed, and then I'll have to crawl from room to room when I'm bad. All I've got to look forward to now is things getting worse. It's like walking down an alley that's getting narrower with no doors. It's sort of less place to move around.
Yeah.
I can't once, and I don't want to live the life I've got now.
What other things have you considered?
I have tried, and I seem fairly indestructible on that point.
You have tried to kill yourself, yes?
Yes.
How many times?
Right. Once was I took 3 months worth of morphine tablets, and that should have flattened an elephant initially. But apparently, no, all I did is knock myself out for 5 days. Kind of opened my eyes. And the very first thing that flashed across my mind was over. Just utter frustration. Comes to the point where I'm going to have to rely on somebody else, pay somebody else to do it for me, and do it properly. I would like to have a death which is comfortable, relatively painless, and I'm really of the opinion that why shouldn't I?
Why shouldn't he? So, what is the situation with regard to Canadians' views on this issue? You will find consistently for many, many years by now that strong majorities, around 70% of Canadians, support the decriminalization of assisted dying. Interestingly enough, it is even true in surveys commissioned by anti-choice groups such as Life Canada. Now, this matters, of course, because they've loaded questions in order to get the answers that they're hoping for. Even there, acknowledged by them, the majority of Canadians support the decriminalization of assisted dying. In Quebec, where current legislation is, of course, considered in terms of decriminalization, support for decriminalization is running at 86%, ladies and gentlemen. It's very significant, of course, in any democracy. In a recent online survey of Canadian Medical Association members, about 20% of respondents said that they would be willing to provide assistance in dying if it was decriminalized. There's 1 in 5 doctors of this sample, and I need to talk about this sample. 34% of survey respondents were in favor of decriminalization, which suggests that more people are in favor of decriminalization amongst Canadian doctors than would ultimately do it if it came to the crunch. What you might want to keep in mind is that only 2,000 of 73,000 CMA members actually bothered replying to this survey. Now, this low number of respondents to the CMA online poll suggests to me that the majority of Canadian doctors don't feel strongly enough about this matter to even register their views with the CMA. The odds are that those who did might not be terribly representative. 75% of about 2,000 medical specialists in Quebec are in favor of decriminalization. Now, what are the reasons that you will typically hear when people are being surveyed, especially dying people, as to why they would like to see decriminalization? The main concerns have to do with desires to control the circumstances of our death, fear of loss of independence and inability to care for ourselves, fear of cognitive impairment, think about Alzheimer's for instance, but also other circumstances, worries about future pain, worries about poor quality of life. Canadian patients are interested in assisted dying not because of any singular reason. So we cannot reduce it to pain. You really got to get your head around that. Instead, it seems to be the case that our motivation at least is arising from complex combinations of physical, psychosocial, and existential suffering. Importantly, this is a type of suffering that has both objective as well as subjective elements. Why does this matter? It matters because one of the anti-choice activists' mantra has always been that with good palliative care, we can resolve those suffering-related issues. They will always go away and disappear into thin air. And the thing is, of course, that while the palliative care arguably will reduce the number of requests we would have for assisted dying, and that's a good thing. It is also true that for a significant number of patients, that solution would still, in their own considered judgment, would make their lives not worth living to them. And certainly to my mind, their views are the only views that actually matter in this context. Let me preface the 2 slides that I have on ethical reasons, the following remark. In my considered judgment, the debate that we are having here today isn't actually about slippery slopes, the abuse of the vulnerable, or the availability of palliative care. It's a debate that is not unlike in the context of abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and other matters, where consistently over time, The freedom to live and end one's life according to one's own values wins out. And you might want to note in this context that even among religious people in this country, the majority is in favor of decriminalization, even though this majority is smaller as among secular people. Now, in any liberal society, we need, of course, very powerful reasons to prevent legally competent adults from living their lives as they see fit, certainly as far as self-regarding actions are concerned, provided they are based on our informed choices. This is especially true in the context of vital questions, such as life and death questions usually are. And what I'm telling you here is nothing radical. It's fundamental to our common law tradition. There are, of course, as you would expect, constitutional limits. In Canada, it's public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. To my mind, anyone with a competent mind who has made up his or her mind that their life is not worth living any longer, and who maintains this over time, has at least the moral entitlement to be respected in their choices. And surprise, surprise, suicide is not actually illegal in Canada. More than that, what many people do not know, we actually do have a constitutional right to refuse treatment in hospitals or when it comes to medical care. Nobody must treat us against our wishes, even if that means death. So if the outcome, death in this case, that is promoted by a particular action, is in the best interest of a given patient, to my mind, we have no sound reason to deny the same patient active support to achieve the same desirable outcome. There's no reason why we would say, yeah, sure, jump down a cliff, we couldn't care less, right? Refuse treatment, starve yourself to death, feel free to do all these things, because, we can see that under some circumstances, this is not patient's best interest. But if you ask for our help, stuff you. It makes no sense. So in my view, we must not criminalize professionals aiming to assist those of us who have made such a difficult choice. Equally, we must not force anyone to assist those who have made such a difficult choice either. And this, of course, is a plea to protect conscientious objection, like we have, for instance, in the case of abortion. We must also be clear that the sorts of choices that our people make in this context must be voluntary. Nobody must force them to avail themselves of these sorts of options. Now, what are the consequences of decriminalization? What do we know, actually? The first thing we have learned is, despite predictions to the contrary by the anti-choice activists, it has not harmed the trust-based healthcare professional-patient relationship. And the best way to look at that is simply surveys that have been undertaken in the Netherlands and in Belgium and other countries where they have decriminalized, where they said no negative, harmful impact on doctor-patient relationships. There's also no evidence in support of slippery slope claims. In slippery slope, this speaks, of course, fundamentally to the constitutional safety concerns. But let me talk briefly a bit about slippery slopes. Anyone in philosophy knows not to touch slippery slope rhetoric, because it can virtually always be shown to be based on flawed logic. In a nutshell, so was the argument, some people may fear that decriminalizing morally permissible cases of assisted dying will create some kind of slippery slope that could lead to the practice being abused, and to assisted dying occurring then in morally impermissible circumstances. So when you think about the structure of this argument, right, what you need, of course, to substantiate your slippery slope claims, you need two measuring points. One at the beginning, you need to know how it was before you decriminalized, and one showing you what happened after you have decriminalized. But what you can't do is, you can't just say, look, in this decriminalized society, all these things are happening, because you do not know, A, whether this is any worse than it was before, and B, you don't know whether this actually is caused by decriminalization as opposed to other factors, right? So anti-choice activists typically point to what they consider abuse and claim mistakenly that this shows that decriminalization is leading to what they consider to be abuse. In most of their cases, I have to be honest, I don't even buy the abuse stories. But what I find disconcerting here is the suggestion that even in cases where we could agree that abuse arguably took place, in other words, where, say, Alex and I would agree that this has really been an abusive case that is described, there's no evidence that this abuse actually is a result of decriminalization rather than, say, a result of better reporting mechanisms, more transparency, and so on and so forth. Now, it is true, we have only limited evidence of clandestine abusive practices prior to decriminalization. But we do know, of course, that assisted dying is taking place across the world, whether you have decriminalized it or whether it is criminalized. That's true, actually. I have it on my clock here, so I'll be fine. But based on what we know, we can actually say with confidence that such cases have decreased since decriminalization. In Belgium, for instance, one of the poster boys and girls of the anti-choice people, since decriminalization, because we have data from prior to decriminalization of assisted dying, since decriminalization, illegal and unprosecuted practices went down from 4.3% to 2.7%. Another slippery slope argument attacks that jurisdictions would inevitably widen the availability of assisted dying. Now, the thing with this argument is, of course, that it begs the question of whether, depending on the proposed policy changes, would be a good or a bad thing. It isn't unusual, after all, in democracies that laws and regulations are changed because public opinion has changed, for instance. That isn't proof of a slippery slope towards unethical or abusive. There's also an evidence in support of abuse of vulnerable claims. The average person, in fact, requesting assistance in dying is an elderly, well-educated, middle-class to upper-class person. Fun fact. It's not the homeless under the bush that's being bumped off. There's no evidence in support that palliative care suffers as a result or after the introduction of assisted dying. Initially, skeptics are overwhelmingly not bothered by assisted dying once it is decriminalized, and that's why I'm not too bothered about the CMA, limited as they are in scope anyway. In the Netherlands, for instance, 84% of Dutch doctors still support assisted dying. That is 10 years later. They have experienced it, and actually they're not bothered about it. So, the other thing that is worth noting from those societies that have decriminalized, there's overwhelming and stable societal support for decriminalization despite very extensive propaganda efforts by groups such as Alex Group and groups in Belgium and the Netherlands and all sorts of places. So they know actually what they're buying. That's the deal. I want to now give you another little video. Andrew's mother. You have heard about Andrew, and here's something interesting. And you might want to consider this if you disagree with Andrew's strategy, because his mother disagreed with his strategy. So it's worth keeping in mind, to my mind at least, how she handled that.
His mother was not very keen on his proposed journey to Switzerland. I was surprised, therefore, when I met her.
So we're here with him to support him. So as a mother, I'm going to swing like this next week. Should I have torn up the passports?
Yes.
You know, anything in desperation to keep him, but it's selfish. It is a selfish and not a loving thing to do. I don't think like Andrew thinks on this one. You know, I always think tomorrow is another day. It's just so stressful again and so hurtful for us all to have to be in a country that isn't home. And I'm going to have to go home tomorrow without my son. And I shall in due course apparently get some ashes to it. We'll just have to get through it because we can't bear to think of him lying in bed and some of the conditions we know he could possibly end up in. It took me a long, long while to realise that the quality of life that he has now is not acceptable. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. It is their decision, and I think it's their right.
I've probably done more good with that speech than I have for a long time.
This speech is what I feel here.
Well, exactly, but it was what you felt there.
It is what I feel.
That's what she felt. Let me make one last point, and actually going to make it. Yeah, I have 1 minute left to come to. Yeah, not bad, huh? Onto the camera. I don't know what they make with that. Or all of that. Anyway. So the last but not least point I really want to make is this. You need to keep something else in mind. It is really important to keep in mind in this context that not decriminalizing and keeping the status quo is not a cost-neutral activity. So the idea we just drag on as we do is not cost-neutral. Because this act of omission, not changing the situation that we have, condemns many of us to unnecessary stress and suffering towards the end of our lives. This daily occurring cost must be balanced against any real or mostly imagined risks associated with the decriminalization of assisted dying. I think this really is very important to not assume that we just continue as we do. There's no cost attached to that. And I'll leave you with that, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. So thanks for your time.